I told Morgan of Howl's death, and she said she had seen Gwendolen, Merlin's wife, cut down by a Silurian. Godovin was safe, but no one knew what had happened to poor Pellinore or to Druiden. None of Norwenna's guards had survived, though a handful of Druiden's wretched soldiers had reached the dubious safety of Ermid's Hall, as had 3 of Norwenna's weeping attendants, and a dozen of Merlin's frightened foundlings. "We have to go soon," I told Morgan. "They're chasing Nimue." Nimue was being bandaged and clothed by Ermid's servants.
"It's not Nimue they're after, you fool!"
Morgan snapped at me.
"But Mordred!"
"Mordred's dead," I protested. But Morgan answered by turning and snatching at the baby that lay in Ralla's arms. She tugged the rough brown cloth away from the child's body, and I saw the clubbed foot.
"Do you think, fool," Morgan said to me, "that I would permit our king to be killed?"
I stared at Ralla and Gwilithin, wondering how they could ever have conspired to let their own son die. It was Gwilithin who answered my mute look.
"He's a king,"
he explained simply, pointing to Mordred, "while our boy was just a carpenter's son."
"And soon," Morgan said angrily, "Gunlius will discover that the baby he killed has 2 good feet, and then he'll bring every man he can to search for us. We go south."
There was no safety in Ermid's Hall. The chief and his warriors had gone to war, leaving only a handful of servants and children in the settlement. We left a little before midday, plunging into the green woods south of Ermid's holdings. One of Ermid's huntsmen led us on narrow paths and secret ways. There were 30 of us, mostly women and children, with only a half-dozen men capable of bearing arms, and of those only Gwilithin had ever killed a man in battle. Druiden's few surviving fools would be no use, and I had never fought in anger, though I walked as a rearguard with Howl's naked sword thrust into my rope belt and the heavy Silurian war spear clasped in my right hand. We passed slowly beneath the oaks and hazels. From Ermid's Hall to Caer-Cadern was no more than a 4-hour walk, though it would take us much longer, for we travelled on secret, circuitous paths, and were slowed by the children. Morgan had not said she would try to reach Caer-Cadern, but I knew the royal sanctuary was her probable destination, for it was there that we were likely to find Dumnonian soldiers. But Gunlius would surely have made that same deduction, and he was just as desperate as we were. Morgan, who had a shrewd grasp of this world's wickedness, surmised that the Silurian king had been planning this war ever since the High Council, just waiting for Uther's death to launch an attack in alliance with Gorfithid. We had all been fooled. We had thought Gunlius a friend, and so no one had guarded his borders, and now Gunlius was aiming at nothing less than the throne of Dumnonia itself. But to gain that throne, Morgan told us, he would need more than a score of horsemen. And so his spearmen would surely even now be hurrying to catch up with their king, as they marched down the long Roman road that led from Dumnonia's northern coast. The Silurians were loose in our country, but before Gunlius could be sure of victory, he had to kill Mordred. He had to find us, or else his whole daring enterprise would fail. The great wood muffled our steps. Occasionally a pigeon would clatter through the high leaves, and sometimes a woodpecker would rattle a trunk not far off. Once there was a great crashing and trampling in the nearby underbrush, and we all stopped, motionless, fearing a Silurian horseman. But it was only a tusked boar that blundered into a clearing, took one look at us and turned away. Mordred was crying and would not take Ralla's breast. Some of the smaller children were also weeping out of fear and tiredness, but they fell silent when Morgan threatened to turn them all into stink-toads. Nimue limped ahead of me. I knew she was in pain, but she would not complain. Sometimes she wept silently, and nothing Lunette could say would comfort her. Lunette was a slender, dark girl, the same age as Nimue, and not unlike her in looks, but she lacked Nimue's knowledge and fey spirit. Nimue could look at a stream and know it as the dwelling place of water spirits, whereas Lunette would simply see it as a good place for washing clothes. After a while, Lunette dropped back to walk beside me.
"What happens to us now, Derval?" she asked.
"I don't know."
"Will Merlin come?"
"I hope so," I said. "Or perhaps Arthur will." I spoke in fervent but disbelieving hope, because what we needed was a miracle. Instead, we seemed trapped in a midday nightmare. For when, after a couple of hours' walking, we were forced to leave the woods to cross a deep, winding stream that looped through grassy pastures bright with flowers, we saw more smoke pyres on the distant eastern skyline, though whether the fires had been set by Silurian raiders or by Saxons taking advantage of our weakness, none could tell. A deer ran out of the woods a quarter-mile to the east. "Down!" the huntsman's voice hissed, and we all sank into the grass at the edge of the wood. Ralla forced Mordred onto her breast to silence him, and he retaliated by biting her so hard that the blood trickled down to her waist. But neither he nor she made a sound, as the horseman who had startled the deer appeared at the tree's edge. The horseman was also to the east of us, but much closer than the pyres, so close that I could see the fox mask on his round shield. He carried a long spear and a horn that he sounded after he had stared for a long time in our direction. We all feared that its signal meant that the rider had seen us, and that soon a whole pack of Silurian horsemen would come into view. But when the man urged his horse back into the trees, we guessed that the horn's dull note meant that he had not seen us at all. Far away another horn sounded. Then there was silence. We waited long minutes. Bees buzzed through the pastures edging the stream. We were all watching the tree line, fearing to see more armed horsemen. But no enemy showed there, and after a while our guide whispered that we were to creep down to the stream, cross it, and crawl up to the trees on its far bank. It was a long, difficult crawl, especially for Morgan with her twisted left leg, though at least we all had a chance to lap at the water as we splashed through the stream. Once in the far woods, we walked with soaking clothes, but also with the relieved feeling that perhaps we had left our enemies behind us, but not, alas, our troubles.
"Will they make us slaves?"
Lunette asked me. Like many of us, Lunette had originally been captured for Dumnonia's slave market, and only Merlin's intervention had kept her free. Now she feared that the loss of Merlin's protection would doom her. "I don't think so," I said. "Not unless Gunlius or the Saxons capture us. You'd be taken for a slave, but they'd probably kill me." I felt very brave saying it. Lunette put her arm into mine for comfort, and I felt flattered by her touch. She was a pretty girl. Until today she had treated me with disdain, preferring the company of the wild fisher boys in Inniswydrin.
"I want Merlin to come back," she said. "I don't want to leave this Tor."
"There's nothing left there now," I said. "We'll have to find a new place to live, or else we'll have to go back and rebuild the Tor if we can. But only, I thought, if Dumnonia survived. Maybe even now, in this smoke-haunted afternoon, the kingdom was dying. I wondered how I had been so blind as not to see what horrors Uther's death would bring. Kingdoms need kings, and without them they are nothing but empty land inviting a conqueror's spears. In mid-afternoon we crossed a wider stream, almost a river, so deep that the water came up to my chest as I waded through. Once on the far bank, I dried off Howl's sword as best I could. It was a lovely blade, made by the famous smiths in Gwent, and decorated with curling designs and interlocking circles. Its steel blade was straight and stretched from my throat to my fingertips when I held my arm straight out. The crosspiece was made of thick iron with plain round finials, while the hilt was of applewood that had been riveted to the tang and then bound about with strips of long thin leather that were oiled smooth. The pommel was a round ball, wrapped with silver wire, that kept breaking free, and in the end I took the wire off and fashioned it into a crude bracelet for Lunette. South of the river was another wide pasture, this one grazed by bullocks that lumbered over to inspect our draggled passing. Maybe it was their movement that attracted the trouble, for it was not long after we had entered the woods on the far side of the pasture that I heard the hoofbeats sound loud behind us. I sent a warning forward, then turned, spear and sword in my hands, to watch the path. The tree branches grew low here, so low that a horseman could not ride down the path. Whoever pursued us would be forced to abandon their horses and follow us on foot. We had not been using the wood's wider paths, but taking hidden trackways that threaded narrowly through the trees, so narrow that our pursuers, like us, would have to adopt a single file. I feared they were Silurian scouts sent far ahead of Gunlius's small force. Who else would be interested in whatever had caused the cattle on the riverbank to stir themselves in this lazy afternoon? Gwilithin arrived beside me, and took the heavy spear out of my hand. He listened to the distant footfalls, then nodded as though satisfied. "Only 2 of them," he said calmly. "They've left their horses and coming on foot. I'll take the first, and you hold the second man till I can kill him." He sounded extraordinarily calm, which helped soothe my fears. "And remember, Derval," he added, "they're frightened too." He pushed me into the shadows, then crouched on the path's far side behind the upended root mass of a fallen beech tree. "Get down," he hissed at me. "Hide." I crouched, and suddenly all the terror welled back inside me. My hands were sweating, my right leg was twitching, my throat was dry. I wanted to vomit, and my bowels were liquid. Howl had taught me well, but I had never faced a man wanting to kill me. I could hear the approaching men, but I could not see them, and my strongest instinct was to turn and run after the women. But I stayed. I had no choice. Since childhood I had been hearing tales of warriors, and had been taught again and again that a man never turned and ran. A man fought for his lord, and a man stood up to his enemy, and a man never fled. Now my lord was sucking at Rala's breast, and I was facing his enemies. But how I wanted to be a child and just run. Suppose there were more than 2 enemy spearmen. And even if there were only 2, they were bound to be experienced warriors, skilled and hardened and careless in their killing. "Calm, boy, calm," Gwilithin said softly. He had fought in Uther's battles. He had faced the Saxon and carried a spear against the men of Powys. Now, deep in his native land, he stooped in the tangle of earthy root-suckers with a half-grin on his face, and my long spear in his sturdy brown hands. "This is revenge for my child," he told me grimly, "and the gods are on our side." I was crouched behind brambles and flanked by ferns. My damp clothes felt heavy and uncomfortable. I stared at the trees that were thick with lichens and tangled with leaves. A woodpecker rattled nearby, and I jumped with alarm. My hiding place was better than Gwilithin's, but even so I felt exposed, and never more so than when at last our 2 pursuers appeared just a dozen paces beyond my leafy screen. They were 2 lithe young spearmen with leather breastplates, strapped leggings, and long russet cloaks thrown back over their shoulders.